Welcome to Tracking Pandemics. This is Module 1.1, Natural-Born Killers. In this module, we're going to introduce some of the major pandemic pathogens that have afflicted human populations, learn a little bit more about them, and use that as a jumping-off point to discuss more about how we track and predict pandemics. Let's start with a few take-home messages. The first one is that infectious diseases have been with humans since recorded history began, and likely before that. The second important point to remember as we go through this course is that pandemics are powerful global forces. They have reshaped populations throughout history, they've affected the outcome of conflicts, including major world wars, and they have influenced economic progress. And finally, infectious disease outbreaks occur constantly. Some of these outbreaks spill over from other animals. We call these outbreaks zoonotic. And some are always present in humans. We call these endemic. And we'll go through some of these terms in more details a little bit later. In this slide, on the left side, we have a cartoon representation of some of the sizes of various pandemics, from largest to smallest throughout human history. Again, the size of a pandemic or an outbreak is fuzzy and depends on what basis you're measuring. In this slide, we're going to talk about size in terms of mortality rate, how many people died during a particular outbreak. On the right side, I've tabulated some of the major ones in chronological order. You can see our COVID-19 pandemic is at the top. If you go down to the bottom, one of the earliest known outbreaks of a pandemic pathogen was malaria, around 3200 BC. It's important to note here that many of these pandemic pathogens are still with us. They may not cause quite the disease that they have in the past, but many have transitioned to become somewhat endemic in human populations. Malaria is still here. Black Death is still here. Yellow fever, cholera, flu. A few of these on this chart are vector-borne only. These are the ones with asterisks, including epidemic typhus up in 1916 that caused 6 million deaths over 30 years. Yellow fever in the black text. That again is an ongoing pandemic in certain, or epidemic in certain parts of the world. Causes millions of deaths per year. Let's go through some of these top killers. Starting back in the earliest times, malaria. Malaria is caused by a protozoan, so not a virus or bacteria, but a eukaryote. Plasmodium falciparum and related pathogens are what we term the etiological agent. That's the microbe, the organism that's been shown to cause this disease. Transmission of malaria is from mosquito to human. This is what we call a vector-borne disease. So you cannot catch malaria from another human being, but you can catch malaria from a mosquito bite. Some of the major pandemic events, back in the 1st century, malaria arrives in Europe, leads to 2 centuries of seasonal fever and millions of deaths. Fast forward to the 15th century, malaria is introduced for the first time into the Americas by European settlers. And today, malaria still kills 1 to 2 million people every year, mostly children, and mostly in developing countries. We've developed interventions for malaria, including anti-parasite drugs, traditionally chloroquine-related drugs, vector control methods, mosquito nets in particular, have shown to be quite effective in preventing the transmission of malaria. Epidemic typhus, or simply typhus, also known as trench fever. This is caused by a bacterium called Rickettsia prowazekii. It's transmitted from body lice to human. Again, another example of a vector-borne disease. You cannot catch typhus from another human, but you can catch it from the lice that live on that human. Major pandemic events, epidemic typhus was considered one of the major killers of human population. 5th century BC killed large numbers of people in Greece. When we talk about these very early pandemic or epidemic events, it's often very difficult, one, to get concrete numbers on how many people are infected, how long it lasts, and how many people die, but also in certain cases on the exact nature of what the disease is. Oftentimes, you only read about the symptoms of particular populations, and those symptoms may overlap between diseases. So the plague of Athens in 5th century BC is likely typhus based on symptoms and the like, but it could be conflated with other diseases at the time. In the 15th century, typhus killed 17,000 in the Grenada War. Certainly not on the level of millions of people, but it was 5 times the number lost to enemies. In the 20th century, typhus killed over 6 million in World War I, the Russian Civil War, and the start of World War II. Interventions. DDT was used as a spray to kill body lice. Improved sanitary conditions went a long way to stopping the transmission of typhus. Eventually, we had antibiotics developed that could fight Rickettsia bacteria directly. This epidemic typhus is one of the clearest examples of how understanding the transmission of a disease led to a rapid decline in mortality and morbidity from that disease. Once we understood that typhus was transmitted by body lice, and by improving sanitary conditions, in other words, not sharing blankets or washing blankets in very hot water between uses, we dramatically decreased how many people are killed by typhus. Smallpox, caused by variola virus, a member of the pox virus. This is our first human-to-human transmissible disease. In the 2nd century, smallpox was responsible for 3 to 7 million Romans during the Antonine Plague. In the 16th century, it's estimated roughly 90% of indigenous North and South American peoples were killed by smallpox alone. 17th and 18th century saw smaller epidemic events, relatively smaller in Europe, that killed over 400,000 per year. Interventions. One of the first vaccines developed by Edward Jenner in 1796 was against smallpox. Plague, the Black Death. I'm sure you've all heard of this. Black Death caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It's transmitted from fleas to humans and then from human to human. So this is a zoonotic disease that is initially vector-borne but can be transmitted between humans. Several major events centered around the Black Death or plague. 6th century, the plague of Justinian killed about half of the population of Europe. In the 14th century, probably where we're most familiar with Black Death, plague killed 1 in every 3 Europeans. It's 30%. And in 19th century, relatively recently, the Yunnan plague in China killed 12 million people. Since Yersinia pestis is a bacterium, antibiotics were effective against it, and so the development of antibiotics went a long way to ending the plague as a major pandemic pathogen. Improved sanitary conditions did as well. We're no longer living in close contact with rodents that carry fleas that can transmit the Black Death. We do still see occasional instances of plague. You probably read about them every year when they open the cabins in Northern California to go camping. They have to take special precautions to make sure that the mice and other rodents that inhabit those cabins during the off-season are removed so that they can't transmit pestis to humans. Yellow fever is caused by a flavivirus transmitted from mosquito to human, so another vector-borne disease. You can't catch yellow fever from another human being. Yellow fever was probably most famous for the 1880 outbreak that killed 20,000 people during an attempt to build the Panama Canal. In the Americas in 1793, 10% of the population of Philadelphia, which at the time was the capital, were killed by yellow fever over the course of about a year to a year and a half. Interventions, as you might imagine, eradicating mosquitoes. There's also now a vaccine against yellow fever. If you're traveling to an area of the world that's endemic or has a lot of the Aedes mosquitoes, you will generally receive the vaccine before you go. Cholera, caused by Vibrio cholerae, another bacterium. This transmission of cholera is a little bit different. It's waterborne. So it's caused by Vibrio, which lives in water naturally, and then transmitted from human to human via fecal-oral transmission. So drinking water is contaminated by waste that is from infected people. That's how it can be transmitted to other humans. There have been 7 cholera pandemics since the early 19th century. These are generally associated with natural disasters. One of the most recent ones was in Haiti in 2010. It was a horrible earthquake. Within the next few months, we saw an outbreak of cholera in Haiti. And we still see cholera killing 100,000 people per year in developing nations or more. Interventions, again, improving sanitary conditions, treating wastewater, rehydrating patients once they're infected with cholera is key to their survival. And there is now a vaccine. One of the common threads that we see and will continue to see as we look at these pandemic pathogens or other outbreak pathogens is how they overlap with sanitation, how they overlap with access to healthcare. These are 2 of the biggest issues trying to combat these pandemic pathogens. Influenza, the flu, caused by influenza A and B. There are 2 main types of flu virus. These are orthomyxoviruses. These are transmitted from human to human. Major pandemic events of the flu in the 20th century, H1N1 killed over 100 million people worldwide. That includes what is colloquially known as the Spanish flu or the 1918 flu. In 2009, quite recently, H1N1 again recurred and killed approximately 200,000 people. At that point, it was called the swine flu. It was thought to jump from swine, from pigs to humans. And seasonal influenza kills up to 650,000 people annually. Interventions to combat outbreaks of the flu include masks, lockdowns or physical distancing, and vaccines. All very familiar to us today, of course. AIDS, or HIV, caused by human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, which is a retrovirus. A retrovirus is a virus that uses RNA as its genetic material, and that RNA is then transcribed, reverse transcribed into DNA and inserted into the host cell genome. It makes retroviruses fascinating from a virus perspective, yet very difficult to combat from a public health perspective. AIDS is transmitted primarily human to human, and generally through sexual contact, but also through things like sharing needles or blood transfusions. Major pandemic events, 20th century, AIDS was discovered in 1981. One of the first recorded cases of AIDS in humans was thought to jump over from monkeys. Monkeys have a similar infection called SIV, or simian immunodeficiency virus. AIDS is an ongoing pandemic. It's killed 30 million people since 1981. We now have various methods for treating AIDS once it's been contracted, including antiviral cocktails. There is no vaccine. If you're old enough to remember, HIV was given a lot of attention in the public conscious through the movie Philadelphia, Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington. And finally, we come to today, SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. Etiological agent is a coronavirus. It's transmitted from human to human by respiratory droplets primarily. There's evidence that SARS-CoV-2 can live on surfaces, but it's not clear how much that contributes to the spread. Major pandemic events, we're all living through this right now. So far, we have 2.1 million humans have been killed by SARS-CoV-2 worldwide. Interventions, as with the flu, which is also transmitted through respiratory secretions, masks, physical distancing are two of the more powerful interventions. And of course, as you all know, we have several new vaccines that have been developed to help fight COVID-19. This is a short walk through some of the big killers, some of the pandemic pathogens that have left a lot of mortality in their wake. But remember, mortality is not the only way to measure the seriousness of an infection or pandemic. There are many, many other infections that are widespread and have significant impact on humans, not just through mortality, but through sickness, through lower quality of life, through economic losses, etc. I've listed some of these here, including Lyme disease, Clostridium difficile, C. diff, hepatitis, dengue, polio, and several antibiotic-resistant bacteria, for example, Klebsiella. So as we go through this tracking pandemics model, we're going to focus, tracking pandemics course, we're going to focus on several pathogens because those are the most common targets of tracking and modeling efforts. But it's important to keep in mind that those are not the only ones.